This is the third in a series of videos about the Lord's Prayer, and I want to reflect for a few minutes on the words, "Give us today our daily bread." Some years ago I was visiting a parishioner and was in the kitchen, and there on the wall was a beautiful piece of embroidery with those words embroidered, "Give us today our daily bread." And of course, it's that context, the context of material food, that most comes to mind when we hear those words. Indeed, that's the prevalent interpretation. And we think that we're praying for food, everyday food, for ourselves and for others. How that interpretation came about is difficult to determine. I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. But for now, we must set aside that interpretation because it is wholly inaccurate. The word that is translated daily in that phrase of the Lord's Prayer is a word that occurs only twice in the entire New Testament. I'm going to have to use some Greek words now just to help you hear the difference. The word that's translated daily is epiousios. The Greek word for day is hemera. Now, if you hear those two words, epiousios and hemera, you can hear the difference. They don't sound alike at all. As I mentioned, this word is only found in Matthew and Luke. It's not found anywhere in the rest of the New Testament. Neither is it found in the translation of the Old Testament into Greek that was done in the 2nd century, called the Septuagint. Neither is it found in any part of classical Greek literature. So when you want to look up a word and you look it up in a dictionary and it shows you where it's used and different usages, we find now that this term has no other usage other than in the Lord's Prayer. So we can't determine what it means by looking it up in a dictionary and by looking at it in other contexts. Some of the early writers were a bit puzzled by it, but most of them tended to translate it differently than it is now translated, to interpret it differently. And certainly most modern scholars believe that it doesn't mean material bread. Why is that the case? Well, perhaps the first reason is that it's simply redundant. If it were daily bread, then we've just said the words, "Give us today." Why do we need to say daily again? It's so obvious that it's a redundancy. So right there we can be pretty sure that it's probably not daily. The other reason is that in the context of the Lord's Prayer, particularly in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is telling us not to be anxious about material things, to consider that how God feeds the birds, how He is taking care of us, and how we are to seek first the kingdom and trust that God is providing for other things. There is nothing else, furthermore, in the Lord's Prayer that's material that we should pray about. And so for these reasons, let alone other parts of the New Testament, it's probably pretty much certain that it isn't material bread. So what kind of bread is it? We know that the word bread can have a meaning that is beyond the material. Most of all, we would think of John chapter 6, in which Jesus says, "I am the bread of life. Those who eat my flesh and drink my blood abide in me, and I in them." That was an interpretation that many of the early writers went to in trying to understand what this bread would be. When St. Jerome translated the Greek New Testament into Latin, he took the word in its two places and translated it differently. So in Luke, he used a word that we in English would translate as daily, and that's probably where this term comes from, daily. But in Jerome's version of Matthew, he used another word in Latin, a word in English that we get as super essential, super substantial bread. A more mysterious meaning. One early church writer translated this term, "Give us today the bread of the age to come." The Lord himself, of course, who will come at the end of the age. So this bread is not material and is the Lord himself. That would seem to be the majority tendency in understanding what this is. But nevertheless, there is still some obscurity and difficulty here. And so there's another aspect to this petition that is that's helpful and instructive. So often we think, well, I really need to understand something cognitively, agree to it, in order to pray, or I need to understand a person's circumstances in order to pray intelligently for that person. But this term in the Lord's Prayer helps us to understand that we are humbled, that we are told to say this, we're told to pray this, even though we don't fully know what it means. That here the Lord has given us something to pray, and we're to pray it. And we're to say to the Lord effectively, Lord, I've no idea completely what this word means. I think it means this, but I can't be 100% sure. But you've told me to say it. You've told me that you're going to provide it. So I long for this bread. I ask for it, even though I'm not quite sure what it is. We can be perhaps fairly sure that it is the Lord himself, but there is an element there that we're still not sure exactly how to translate. So we're humbled. We're driven to trusting the Lord and using the prayer he's given, even though we're not entirely sure about its precise meaning. Give us today our daily bread.